In 2001, Max Payne threw players into the dark, snow-covered streets of New York City. It blended gritty noir storytelling with groundbreaking gameplay mechanics, and with it its iconic bullet time feature and graphic novel-style comic panels. Max Payne delivered a psychological thriller unlike anything gamers had seen before. But what many don't know is that this revolutionary experience was crafted by a group new to creating video games, a small Finnish studio, Remedy Entertainment. Born out of Finland's underground digital art subculture known as the demoscene, Remedy thrived on experimentation and collaboration, its members improvising solutions and learning as they went. When it came to Max Payne, the small team had to rely on these skills, tackling everything from coding to animation, pushing their creativity to the limit to redefine the action genre and leave a mark on gaming history forever. During the surge of Finland's underground digital art subculture, the demoscene, a group of young programmers and artists were pushing the boundaries of creativity and technology. A collective known as Future Crew would go on to craft one of the most influential PC demos ever made, Second Reality, released on assembly in 1993. But their ambitions extended beyond the demoscene to video games. Realizing that Future Crew wouldn't evolve into a commercial video game developer on its own, several members decided to forge a new path. In 1995, Samuli Saivakioko, Markus Maki, Sami Nopinen, John Kevalev, and Sami Van Hatalo officially founded Remedy Entertainment. Operating out of the basement of Savakio's parents' house in Espo's West End district, the team created their first project, Death Rally. It was a vehicular combat racing game published by Apogee Software in 1996. With creative input from Apogee Scott Miller, Remedy infused the game with chaotic, adrenaline-fueled action. When the team needed dialogue for the game, Petri Järvielto reached out to his friend Sam Lake, a literature student at the University of Helsinki. Lake's contribution of Death Rally would mark the beginning of a creative partnership that would alter Remedy's future forever. After Death Rally, Remedy Entertainment had momentum, but they weren't content with staying in the same lane. They wanted something bigger, something that could push them beyond. When the time came to pitch their next project, they went all in. Remedy flew to Dallas to meet with Apogee, who were now 3D Realms, and laid out 3 ideas: a racing game, a space combat title called Void, and a gritty crime thriller called Dark Justice. Their plan? Develop all 3 at the same time. Scott Miller, the founder of 3D Realms, immediately pushed back. I pretty much immediately shot the racing game down. They also had a pitch for a space combat game called Void. It was a good pitch, but I was more interested in their third idea, and that was a gritty detective game they called Dark Justice. Miller had seen potential in the concept, a game with a noir-inspired story, action-packed gameplay, and the potential for a lead character that could drive an entire franchise. But he also knew the studio was overreaching. Crazily, they had the idea of making all 3 games simultaneously, he said. I talked them into doing just 2 games, Void and Dark Justice, and then a month later convinced them to focus on the game I wanted to pursue the most, Dark Justice. There was another problem though. Remedy envisioned Dark Justice as a top-down shooter in the style of Loaded, a PlayStation game that featured a fast-paced gunplay from an isometric perspective. Miller wasn't having it. I knew that top-down was the past, and full 3D was the future, and that was the only version of the game I wanted to be involved with. He pushed Remedy to rework the game into a true third-person shooter, inspired by Tomb Raider, but without what he called its horrid camera system. But this wasn't just about making a game, it was about building something substantial. Miller saw a chance to create a franchise, a character that could transcend gaming. I was selling them on the big picture idea of building a strong character-driven transmedia franchise with a compelling story, unique character traits, and naming the game based on the lead character like we had done with Duke Nukem, he explained. At that first meeting, I even said, guys, if we're successful, there'll be a film based on this character and his story. But the name Dark Justice wasn't going to cut it. If they were building a franchise, the lead character needed to be the focus. The team went back and forth, searching for something with weight, something that could stick. Scott Miller knew they needed a name that could sell a character, not just a game. I finally came up with Max, he said. It was strong, simple, marketable. But a first name alone wasn't enough. The last name had to carry just as much impact. For a while, they thought they had it, Max Heat. It fit the game's tone, the intensity of its action. Confident enough in the choice, they spent $15,000 to trademark it. But something was off. Although we knew it wasn't perfect, we went and got a trademark on Max Heat mostly as a backup plan, Miller admitted. They knew they needed something better. The search continued. 3D Realms and Remedy scoured for options, tossing around ideas, testing combinations. Then, after weeks of back and forth, Remedy asked their internal team to submit names. And a couple weeks later, a list of 30 to 40 potential last names arrived. Miller scanned the list, and then, boom, there was Payne, he recalled. It was a holy cow moment, because I immediately knew it was perfect. It clicked instantly. A name that just wasn't memorable. It told a story on its own. The weight of loss, the burden of violence, the inevitability of suffering. Max Payne. They scrapped Max Heat without hesitation, spending another small fortune securing the new trademark. This time, there was no second guessing. Max Payne wasn't just a character. He was becoming an icon in the making. It was the exact kind of branding Miller believed in, a strong character-driven title that could sustain sequels and spin-offs, rather than being tied to a specific setting. With Tomb Raider, every story you tell sorta needs to involve a tomb. Otherwise, the title doesn't fit, Miller explained. This is why I think it was a mistake not to name the Tomb Raider games after the lead character, Lara Croft, instead. For Max Payne, there would be no such limitation. His name wasn't just a title, it was an identity. Scott Miller had no doubt that Remedy had something special. Sam Lake, the pen name of Remedy's creative director, Sami Jarvi, was brought on from the start and began writing the script. I think the full script ended up around 250 to 300 pages. It was finished within 6 months of the project starting and revised all the way through development of the game. But in general, Sam's script was the roadmap for the game's level design. From the very start, Miller and 3D Realms knew better than to interfere. From Apogee, there were never any changes to the story. We were pretty blown away by everything Sam was doing from the start. We did throw in the occasional joke, like Max's deadpan thank you when shooting on an elevator speaker, but when it came to the narrative, Remedy had full control. And the narrative took shape fast. The switch from top-down to third person wasn't just a gameplay change, it fundamentally altered how the story had to be told. Peter Harvaletto, one of the key figures in Max Payne's development, saw the transformation happening in real time. We abandoned the top-down perspective and switched to third person. Also, the character and the story started to get much better fleshed out once Sam Lake joined our ranks. One of Lake's most striking contributions was the decision to tell the story through graphic novel-styled cutscenes. It wasn't just a stylistic choice though, it was a practical solution. Full-motion cutscenes would have been too costly, but comic panels with voiceover, that could work. If you think about cutscenes back then, obviously yes, they were very, very expensive, Lake explained. But at the time, they were also kind of very limited and quite clumsy. And we knew that we wanted to tell a more ambitious story than seen in this type of game before. It's much easier to do a very cool and beautiful still image than to animate everything. This method had another advantage, engagement. In a graphic novel, the reader does a lot of the work and kind of invests into it and uses his own imagination to fill in the blanks, Lake said. And it worked very well. We knew that we wanted to use photos as the basis, so we were kind of setting up all the panels and taking photos. In the end, we were using the photos and kind of adding filters and tweaking them. And that's how the final style came about. And the story itself? A revenge tale, yes. But Lake wanted more than just a simple noir setup. He wanted Max Payne to tap into something deeper, something psychological. He envisioned a world where noir wasn't just an aesthetic, it was a sickness. A creeping, all-consuming madness. Max's journey is a revenge story about a man who's been pushed so far into a mad, impossible situation that normal, everyday life has lost its meaning, Lake explained. It's disappeared, so you couldn't describe what was happening in that context, or at least Max couldn't. All that's left are archetypes and metaphors, monsters and demons. It becomes a myth. This mythology wasn't just metaphorical. Max Payne blended classic hard-boiled detective fiction with something more primal, something mythic. Ragnarok, the Norse vision of the end of the world, was as fitting as a reference as any grimy back alley or crack den. I'm a big fan personally of old hard-boiled film noir stuff, like Bogart movies, and wanted to have that kind of feeling there, Lake said. As a kid, I was also a big fan of Lord of the Rings, and that kind of got me into exploring mythology, Norse in particular, which there is quite a lot of in Max Payne. The game dripped with apocalyptic imagery, layering its tale of corruption and vengeance with something ancient, something inescapable. The character expresses himself with the internal monologue, Lake said. He's been pushed so far into this impossible hell situation that everyday life completely loses its meaning, and he needs to look for reference points outside of that. That got me thinking about legends, about gods, and monsters and hell. And yet, despite its bleakness, Max Payne never lost its sense of humor. Lake knew that if the game took itself seriously, it would feel at odds with its over-the-top action. We didn't want to avoid that over-the-top feel because the player is going to create comical situations in any case. Always, he said. Humor is a natural part of playing games, and as a writer, you're always trying to match the gameplay experience. If you're too serious about it, that simply doesn't happen. Developing Max Payne took multiple years, beginning in the mid to late 90s and evolving alongside major advancements in gaming technology. When Remedy first conceptualized the game, it had a more stylized, hand-drawn aesthetic. But as 3D graphics hardware improved, they saw an opportunity to push for a more realistic look. However, creating an authentic lived-in version of New York City required more than just artistic skill. It demanded real-world reference material. To achieve this, the team took a research trip to New York, determined to capture the city's atmosphere firsthand. The only problem was, what do we Finns really know about New York? Recalled one of the developers. We had dug the deepest depths of the web for any and all pictures and tidbits of information. We had collected a whole library of New York City books, but we were still missing the first-hand experience. And most of all, we were missing a whole lot of good photo material. For many of the developers, it was their first time in the US, let alone the bustling streets of Manhattan and its grittier boroughs. They weren't just sightseeing, they were on a mission to document the real New York, from seedy back alleys to towering skyscrapers, ensuring that every level in the game felt genuine. Accompanied by 2 former NYPD officers serving as bodyguards, the team ventured into crime-ridden neighborhoods, abandoned buildings, and underbelly hideouts that mirrored the dark world of Max Payne. We set out in our rented van, midnight black naturally. In Bronx, we visited some lovely ex-crack houses, and had some close encounters with the natives, curious of the 6 strangers visiting their hoods, the developer continued. In Crown Heights, the worst part of Brooklyn, we entered an abandoned house in the worst imaginable state of dereliction, up to our knees in used drug syringes and empty methadone jars. It was all the crime movies made real. In Little Odessa, a Russian enclave in Brooklyn, the group found themselves face to face with locals who weren't too happy about their camera crew. Mike discreetly opening his jacket and giving them a good long look at his gun was the only reason we got to keep our stuff, they explained. Even their drive past a known mafia headquarters carried an air of danger. Stopping for a closer look wasn't an option. Yes, we had found the limits to our bravery. There were things even we were not ready to do. Dark depths of trouble we did not wish to explore. By the end of the trip, the team had amassed over 5,000 photographs and 10 hours of video, providing an extensive library of real-world textures, locations, sounds, and atmospheric details. This experience wasn't just about gathering assets. It shaped Max Payne's visual identity, grounding its noir-inspired world in a level of authenticity rarely seen at the time. With a limited budget and no access to motion capture, the team had to make the most of every available resource. Many of the character models were based on photos of Remedy employees, friends, and even random people they could convince to participate. Sam Lake's mother and father were also in it, even the guy who was delivering Coca-Cola to our house. Sammy Van Huntalo shared, "We didn't really need to pay him anything. He just sat on a chair for like 10 to 15 minutes so we could take proper photos of him, to use as reference material for the 3D models." The decision to use photo textures for character faces and environments was both a creative solution and a technical necessity. Because we decided to use photo textures, we needed faces to photograph, one developer explained. The Remedy staff were the closest people we could find. The people in the neighboring companies in the same office complex, and friends of the dev team were the second closest. While some artists resisted the idea, believing it took away from the traditional artistic craftsmanship, others saw it as a practical step forward. If you're basing things on the real world, it's just a sensible thing to do, said studio co-founder Marcus Maki. Despite being the mechanic that would define Max Payne, bullet time was not originally planned for the game. The idea came later in development, about 15 months in, when Max Payne's publisher 3D Realms pushed for more realism in how bullets move through the environment. Co-founder Scott Miller explained, "Another one of my requested features for Max Payne was for actual flying through the air bullets, versus instant traveling bullets like in every other shooter. I sold this idea to Remedy by suggesting we wanted the game's bullet realism to match its visual realism." This push for a more grounded shooting system led Remedy to ditch the traditional hit scan method, which made bullets instantly connect with their targets. Instead, bullets in Max Payne traveled at realistic speeds, requiring players to lead their shots when aiming at distant enemies. But this small change would lead to something much bigger. During one of Miller's visits to Remedy's offices in Finland, the developers demonstrated a new enemy death animation, where defeated enemies fell in slow motion, with the camera dramatically panning around them. An effect inspired by action films, particularly John Woo's The Killer and Hard-Boiled. While impressive, Miller immediately saw untapped potential. "I knew there was a much bigger prize to be scored. I suggested that this slow motion stuff was far too cool to only use for the deaths of thugs, and that we needed to find a way to implement it as gameplay." That night, Miller wrote down his idea: give the player full control over slow motion, allowing Max to move at reduced speeds alongside enemies. but with one key difference. His aim would still remain fast and responsive. The player needed to be able to activate the slow motion mode as a talent, and while the whole world around him moves slow, including his own body, he can still aim fast to shoot bad guys. Remedy took the suggestion and ran with it, soon adding what would become one of Max Payne's most iconic abilities, bullet time. Petri Järvielto, one of the game's lead designers, had already been toying with the concept of slow motion in combat. According to Sami van Hantalo, the game's lead technical artist, one of the first things we did was the particle system. And once you started seeing the particle effects with this huge slowdown, it was like, God, something good must come of this. Remedy quickly realized that integrating slow motion directly into the player's toolkit could revolutionize how third-person shooters played. Sam Lake described the moment that they knew they had cracked it. Give the control of this mechanic to the player, so the player can press a button and go into slow-mo. That was the moment when we knew, okay, this is how it should work. The system wasn't just a gimmick, it completely changed the way Max Payne was played. The game encouraged players to leap into combat, dodging gunfire while picking off enemies mid-air. Initially, shoot dodging was limited. Players could only dive in one direction, and aiming was locked in place. But after a "wouldn't it be cool if" email from texture artist Timo Hayantahelo, the team expanded the mechanic, allowing players to freely aim while diving. Animation artist Peter Hedgeba explained the technical challenges of making this system work. We spent quite a bit of time and effort on this, and the result was a blend of 8 dive animations. Dive in one direction, turn any way you want. We couldn't cover aiming up and down, but still, doing 360-degree turning was already quite an improvement. Since full motion capture wasn't an option at the time due to cost, Remedy had to get creative. They filmed a gun specialist performing dives, and then hand-animated Max's movements by analyzing the footage, frame by frame. Hedgeba even studied classic Hong Kong action films for additional inspiration. I realized I didn't have to rely on our own footage. I could also watch some Hong Kong action movies and see how the stuntmen performed their deaths. So I manually animated some death animations based on those. The final piece of the puzzle was making bullet time feel cinematic. While bullets in real life travel at speeds between 700 to 1200 miles per hour, Remedy had to slow them down significantly to make them visible in slow motion. Matthias Millerin recalls, to make them visible in slow motion, they wouldn't actually be flying as fast as bullets. They'd be flying at something like 80 miles an hour, but they'd have the weight of 2 bowling balls to get the right kind of ragdolls. This careful balancing act ensured that bullet time felt powerful and dramatic, while still being functional. While some players assume The Matrix was the inspiration behind Max Payne's bullet time, Valhatalo clarifies that it was actually developed before the Wachowskis' film hit theaters. This was actually when we demoed the game at E3 Gaming Expo, and that was a few years before The Matrix came out. So The Matrix was not an influence. Ultimately, bullet time transformed Max Payne into something more than just another third-person shooter. It gave players control over a mechanic that felt intuitive, stylish, and deeply satisfying. Sam Lake sums up its impact best. It's such a visual and cinematic way of adding depth and adding excitement to combat. Max Payne wasn't just another action game either. Between its noir storytelling, cinematic gunfights, and the revolutionary use of bullet time, it carved out an identity that set it apart from everything else at the time. But beyond the gameplay, there was another thing that stuck with players long after the credits rolled. Max's face. Every time Max fired a gun, he wore the same intense squinting expression. It became so ingrained in the game's identity that for many players, it's the first thing they think of when they hear the name Max Payne. Sam Lake, who not only wrote the game, but also provided Max's likeness, explained how it happened. To me, the mental process was like, okay, you're a tough guy in a dark alley, trying to see through the night. Then, with every gunshot, there's this big muzzle flash. So you squint, and that's a tense situation. It wasn't meant to be the defining image of the game, but the screenshots changed everything. Back then, gaming magazines and websites always wanted the most dramatic shots to show off new games. With Max Payne, that meant every action scene with bullets flying and flashes lighting up the screen. But because the game swapped Max's face to his firing expression at the exact moment, that's the look everyone saw over and over again. So in every screenshot, he's mid-shootout squinting, Lake said. It just got burned into everyone's memory. Controversy was another thing that followed Max Payne, though not as much as some expected. The game had all the elements that typically stirred up backlash: graphic violence, drug use, and a protagonist with no regard for the law. But according to Scott Miller, that kind of controversy could actually be a good marketing tool. If you can build controversy into a game, do it, he said. Duke Nukem only had a couple of levels with strippers, no nudity, but people lost their minds over it. That's free publicity. Still, the game's real strength wasn't in shock value, it was in positioning. Miller understood that in order to succeed, Max Payne needed to own something. Max Payne is gaming's leading vigilante cop. That's his category, and his attribute, bullet time, Miller explained. Just like Volvo owns safety and McDonald's owns fast, Max Payne owns bullet time. That thinking carried over into the game's marketing. Instead of bombarding players with endless previews, Remedy and 3D Realms carefully controlled what they showed. We didn't overhype the game, we let players and the press do that for us, Miller said. Too many developers flood the internet with screenshots and gameplay clips, and people just get tired of the game before it even launches. Instead, we teased just enough, and when we did show Max Payne, we made sure it was something no one had ever seen before. When Max Payne finally launched, it lived up to its reputation, mostly. Critics praised the game's atmosphere, cinematic presentation, and bullet time mechanics, though some found the story predictable. The PlayStation 2 version took the biggest hit, with long load times and technical downgrades that broke the pacing. Despite that, Max Payne was a massive success. It sold 82,000 copies in its first month. It went on to become one of the best-selling PC games of 2001. Over time, it sold over 4 million copies worldwide. But Max Payne wasn't just a game. It was a defining experience for a generation of players. It proved that video games could be more than just reflexes and high scores. They could be cinematic, stylish, and emotionally gripping. Its influence stretched far beyond its sequels, with bullet time becoming a defining mechanic in some of the most acclaimed action games to follow. But more than that, it left a feeling of sense of weight, of consequence, of stepping into the shoes of a broken man with nothing left to lose. Even as the industry evolved, as technology advanced, and trends shifted, Max Payne's shadow never faded. It wasn't just a product of its time. It was a game that redefined what action games could be. And for those who played it, that slow-motion dive through a hail of gunfire wasn't just a mechanic. It was a moment. One that, decades later, still refuses to be forgotten. And if you enjoyed that video, make sure to watch this one next.